Hello and welcome to my workshop. So we're getting back on the Jeep Scrambler build. Now this started out as an RC 4-wheel drive Jeep, did some conversions, turned it into a Scrambler, and we're going to finish that up. Alright, so let's get started. The taillights were 3D printed and the reflector part was made from a clear resin. The real one has a thin plastic housing which protrudes past the base that holds the lens in place. I decided to just paint this on the back of the lens with black paint. First though, I need to add clear red from Tamiya. The base is spray painted black and then glued to the lens. The rest can be painted black by hand. I've been making a lot of 3D printed parts, which mostly I design. Fusion 360 has a play button which makes a clip of all the processes in the timeline. Here is one from designing the door panels for the Scrambler. The interior will need to be bolted in place, so I can detail all the pieces and put them in after the body is painted separately. A piece of styrene is cut to fit the shape of the cab. This will serve as the floor and give me a place to mount the seats. The best way I have found to mount these pieces is with thick styrene shapes glued to the body. I cut these pieces and then glue them to the body on the sides and the rear. Holes are drilled into the floor that line up with these glued on shapes. If you are careful, an M2 screw can be threaded into a 1.5mm hole to secure the panel. It holds really well, but it is easy to strip if you get carried away. Another thing I have learned to avoid is using power tools when removing the screws. The heat the screw builds up when spun out fast can actually melt the threads and cause them to stick to the screw. After 3D printing the door panels, they are sprayed black. I'm trying to replicate an existing Jeep, and he has an aftermarket center console. I decided to just scratch build it from styrene, since it's mostly flat panels. The real one looks to be all metal, with a small armrest and a spot to hold the radio. You will see later that the factory locations in the dash is blanked off. It doesn't take too long and the piece is ready for sanding and a coat of paint. I used a similar technique to mount the center console to the floor. A styrene shape is glued to the bottom of the console, giving plenty enough material for a screw to bite into. This is then attached to the center hump, made from vacuum forming over a piece of PVC pipe. The bottom of the door panel has a carpet strip attached, so I applied some clear coat and used my flocking tool to put down some gray flocking. It's amazing how much of a charge this thing builds up. So the next thing I add are the chrome strips. These are created with a Molotov pen. The main dash panel was 3D printed, but several of the details were glued in place. This allows me to paint pieces, like the gauge bezels, separately and install once all the pieces are painted. When I removed the side steps, a section of the fender had to be removed. The Scrambler has the fenders going pretty much straight down, but the original had them swooping back. I was able to cut off a small piece and shape it back on the fender. Once the transition was filled in and sanded back, it looks pretty much like the real Scrambler. I try my best to get things exact, but sometimes good enough is what you need. The other option was to remove the fender and start new, and that just didn't make sense. Once again, I am using my Cricut machine to cut out the Jeep letters before solvent gluing them on the body. Once painted, these will look just like the stamped letters on the Scrambler. I don't seem to use my Cricut as much now that I have a 3D printer. I was designing pieces and gluing them up in multiple layers. Now I'll just make the part from resin and move on. I can honestly say I don't miss laminating these sheets of styrene to make parts, but it's good to know I can if needed. The entire body was wet sanded to 600 grit after a liberal coat of primer was applied. This is followed by a thin coat of black paint. Sometimes the hardest part is trying to find good reference material. For some reason, there are certain angles people take pictures, and if you need something different, it can take a lot of digging to find just the right picture. Eventually I found some good shots of the covers for the taillights. These will serve the same purpose for the scale truck as the 1-to-1. Once complete, they will be bolted in place and will hide the wires when LEDs are installed. I drilled a small hole in the bed, which they also cover up, and that allows the wires to be ran out. It's getting close to the end of this build, but there are still a few pieces to sort out. One is the roll bar for the bed. I found some suitably sized stainless steel capillary tubing, which gets bent into shape. If I could find some, I would have liked to have some tubing that was, say, 1 millimeter larger. But in all honesty, that is something probably only I would ever notice. Well, and I suppose you will now. When you're trying to get matching bends, it's critical to take good measurements. I'm doing my best to take good notes so I don't get lost and make a mistake. I was able to get the bend to sit perfectly between the bed with just the right angle on the legs on my third attempt. Each leg was cut to length at an angle which will match up to the bed. I then drilled and ground out some tabs from scale metal supplies. These were brazed to the legs and small holes drilled in them for some M2 hardware. The roll bar is pretty simple. There's just a hoop and 2 down bars that run over the wheel wells. Once I had all the pieces cut to length and the notches made in the tube, 1, 2, 3 blocks were used to help me position the pieces in preparation for brazing. With the roll bars finished, it was time to move to the seats and finish up the interior. I went back and forth on how best to make the seats. In the end, I chose to carve them and make vacuum forms from styrene. The basic shape was calculated based on dimensions I found online. I still have to tweak it since my floor is probably not exactly where they have the original one though. Since these parts are pretty small, I chose to sand them by hand. This does include the use of my Multimax tool though. I mainly am avoiding using the large benchtop sander. My fear is the sander will take too much off and I will ruin the mold. I'm also using some carving tools to help cut the seams into the seat. I make a channel and then sand back on each side to make the transition smooth. This represents how the material is pulled on a curve down into the seam. I place in some smaller seams which run across the seat with a very small burr bit on the rotary tool. After vacuum forming, the pieces are cleaned up and prepared for gluing. The seat can stay hollow, but I wanted to finish off the back of the upper piece. I first thought of vacuum forming the piece upside down. However, the vacuum form turned out well enough that all I needed was a small piece with a slight bend on the end to be glued into place. This was just cut out by hand from a scrap piece of styrene. So the seats get styrene pieces glued to the seat base. Just like the other pieces, this allows the seat to be screwed in place after all the paint work is complete. The taillights, hood latches, and windshield wipers are fitted in place after the final coats of clear are applied to the body. Luckily, I remembered that I hadn't cut out the windshield yet. Since the glue on the windshield wipers was not yet cured, I quickly removed them. This allows me to place a piece of masking tape over the opening to trace out the shape. One of the nicest things about these Jeeps is all the glass pieces are flat, so no curving the clear plastic, or worse yet, having to vacuum form it to shape. The original Jeep has a faded roof and lower side rails. It's hard to get that exact faded black color, so I went with a sheen change instead. Masking tape was used to section off the roof before painting it matte black. The end result isn't a perfect match, but looks really good. I'm always nervous about pulling off tape, but in this case the fresh paint didn't get messed up. The completed door panel gets a thin layer of CA glue before holding it in place and letting the CA glue cure. The raised Jeep logo on each side was painted with a Molotov chrome pen. It's pretty simple to get a straight line on the edges of the letters if you try not to push too hard with the pen. My original idea was to make a small piece to vacuum form the dash cap. When I started looking at it, I realized this could be modeled very quickly in Fusion 360 and would be easier to print than to vacuum form. Many of my builds used the round Mojave lens, but this one was a bit smaller. I took the 3D print file from the headlight bezel and scaled it down to fit. The last detail for the dash are the gauge faces. I make these by printing out scaled down pictures on regular printer paper. This paper is sprayed several times with a clear coat spray. The spray pretty much soaks through the paper, and once cut out, you get an accurate looking replica of the gauge face. With the dash sorted out, it can be glued in place before screwing in the interior floor. This is the piece which holds the seat and the center console. It is not often I have a hard time passing on a build. However, this is one I could see in my permanent collection. Sadly though, it has to move on. There will be plenty more fun builds coming up, but until then, I'll see you in the rocks.
Yeah.